Some political commentators advise Africans to speed up African integration. Do you think that it will be possible in near future?
Yes. If you look at historically, one of the first proponent of this idea, this notion of united Africa, was actually the president of Ghana, former president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who advocated for the continental government, United States of Africa, and whatever, particularly in 1960s. And you have argument and counter argument regarding this idea of integration or unifying Africa. That's why in 1963, Organization of African Unity, OAU, was established as a compromise, as a middle of the road approach, a compromise actually between those who were in support of establishing an African government and then those who are saying that, okay, it should be gradual. So OAU was established in 1963 in order to champion the cause of Africa's integration. So it's very possible to integrate the continent, but we have to define what do we mean by integration in this context. Because we have this issue of colonial legacy, colonial boundaries, and whatever. So integration in this sense should be clearly defined in this regard. That's why one of the manifestation of this effort could be seen in the notion of even the African Union, OAU metamorphosed into African Union or renamed in the year 2002. So it's very possible to integrate the continent, but we have to look at, we would define in clear cut terms what do we mean by this integration. Integration, is it a political level? Is it an economic level? That's right now we have African pre-continental trade area, one of the efforts made by the African Union to engender this development, this economic integration of the whole continent. So it's very possible, but we have to take some steps, particularly this idea of our history, this idea of Pan-Africanism and others.
What role should regional bodies like IGAD, ECOWAS, and others together with the AU do in accelerating African integration move?
Okay, I think they have a greater role to play, a tremendous role to play in this regard. If you look at these regional bodies, in fact, there should be a step towards integration. You start from even the regional bodies, and then later you have the continental body. So I think in their individual, for example, regions, these regional bodies, for example, IGAD in the East Africa, you have ECOWAS, for example, in West Africa, and other regional bodies could play a vital role in facilitating this notion of integration by coming up with policies that will help in integrating the economies starting from their respective regions. For example, in ECOWAS, we talk about even issue of you have issue of ECO, trying to at least have a common currency and what have you at the economic level. So at least for us to engender this integration at the regional level, regional bodies could play a vital role, as evident in the issue of IGAD, issue of ECOWAS, and what have you, by coming up with common currency, issue of common market, issue of pre-movement of people, because some of these regional bodies have been criticized that there should be paradigm shift from ECOWAS of government to ECOWAS of the people, that people should be allowed to move freely, that goods should be allowed to move freely. There are some rules that will govern this, but I think regional bodies should be seen as step towards the greater integration of the whole continent.
Well, poor communication between Africans is attributed to absence of common media platform in the continent. Even some African leaders are calling for this media platform. Is it possible to achieve this?
Okay, thank you very much. First, communication, information, or particularly this media, is very important in 21st century. That's why one American historian says that Karl Marx said that history is shaped by the control of the means of production. But in our time, history is shaped by the control of the means of communication. So it means if we want to develop this particular continent, if we want to engender genuine, sustainable integration, we have to look at this issue of African media platform. We have to tell our stories. Over the years, our stories have been told, narrated, propagated by other people, for example, Western media. And if you look at it throughout history, you have this issue of misconception of Africa being a dark continent, Africans being missing link in the chain of human evolution, Africans living like a chaotic mass of disconnected atoms. even in 21st century, you have a carryover of these Western misconceptions about Africa. So I strongly subscribe to this idea that for us to integrate, for us to help in unifying the whole continent, we should start thinking along this path of having or establishing a common media platform, because we need to tell our stories. You know, this media is very powerful. For example, it has a watertight relationship with even the investment we're talking about, issue of economic development. For example, how you report what is happening in your country, in your continent, for example, will attract or discourage investment. So it's very important if we have a common media platform, we'll tell our own part of the story. We will now debunk some of the single stories, some of the maybe propaganda being propagated by these Western media houses. So it's very important. I think it's a very nice, very welcome step if we can think along this particular line.
The issue of having African representation in the Security Council is also echoing among Africans more than ever before. What concrete measure is required of Africans to realize this?
Thank you very much. This is a very, very apt question, actually. If you look at the clamor, the calls, the advocacy, if you look at the composition, anyway, starting from even the Security Council, you'll find out that you'll see imbalance in the composition of, membership of the United Nations Security Council. You have only 5 members who are permanent members of the Security Council, and then they have veto power. For example, at a point, Russia vetoed about 100 resolutions of the United Nations, followed by United States of America. These countries are actually controlling many things. So we need to restructure the Security Council. And then the 10 non-permanent members are just like a mere rubber stamp, if you look at it. So if you look at, for us to address this particular of our representation of the United Nations Security Council, we have to frame the discourse in its proper context. We have to look at the historical injustice, for example, done to Africa. If you look at the composition of the United Nations generally, particularly the membership, Africa has about 28% of the United Nations membership, African continent, followed by Asia, 27%, followed by Europe, about 17%, and then others, you have Western countries constituting about 15%. So it's actually amazing, it's puzzling to find out that the continent with the largest membership, or 28%, is yet to be represented, is not given actually a seat in the United Nations Security Council. So if you look at the various countries vying for this, for example, Nigeria and South Africa. So one of the ways that we should put our house in order as a continent, we should agree which country is actually going for this particular seat, and then we should frame the discourse in its proper historical context that, okay, we need representation at the United Nations Security Council in order to address historical injustice done to the continent, because over the years we have contributed immensely towards the development, towards the activities of the functions of the United Nations. If you look at issue of peacekeeping operations in Liberia, peacekeeping operations in Sierra Leone and other places, Africa has been contributing forces, materials towards achieving this particular goal. So in this context, Africa needs to be represented at the United Nations Security Council, and it should go beyond tokenism speeches. It should go beyond this rhetorics during maybe this. It has become an annual ritual during United Nations maybe General Assembly. People will be talking that we need. So it should go beyond that. If you look at the efforts by former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, in this regard, it should be appreciated how he at least push forward this particular agenda. So now for African leaders, African continent to achieve this, we have to frame the discourse in its proper historical context. One, we have been marginalized, even though we have contributed immensely towards the development of the United Nations, as evident in peacekeeping operations in various parts of the world. So in this context, we should frame our discourse within this particular approach. Then secondly, we should frame it along this issue of democracies and human rights violation. In fact, it constitutes human rights violation not to give Africa a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, because of the role we have played, in addition to historical role we have played in peacekeeping operations, we have contributed immensely in other sectors. So at least it constitutes human rights violation to, violation of even democracy to marginalize Africa in this regard. And then thirdly, we should have a unified approach. There's no way we can achieve this goal if we have division among us, okay? If we have, maybe different countries advocating. That's why that's the interest of even issue of colonialism. Even though now there's no colonialism, but there is coloniality, colonial legacy of this divide and rule. There's some Francophone countries, some are Anglophone, some are Lusophone, and whatever. So unless we develop, unless we cultivate a unified approach, we'll never get there. So unified approach is very important in this regard, and it should be continuous. It should be sustainable, consistent. We should be consistent in our demand. So if we frame it along this, within this context of human rights, issue of democracy, issue of historical injustice, issue of marginalization, and then we have a unified, strong front, then definitely one day this particular goal will be achieved.
Some scholars advise that Africans should first establish Pan-Africanism on a very solid ground to ensure their voice gets heard on a global stage. Do you subscribe to this idea?
Well, yeah, this is a very important thing. As I said, just like in our experience, this is not something new. It has been advocated that we need these Pan-Africanist ideas in order to effectively integrate the continent. But Pan-Africanism came as a result of this, our experience during transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and what have you. It is anchored around this idea of common origin, common identity, and common destiny of Africans. So this idea, it will help, it will go in those, it will go in actually integrating or try to cement Africa. For example, one of the legacies of colonialism is this issue of mental warfare. Okay, it will change our psyche. That okay, we have shared many things in common. That's why, according to Cheikh Anta Diop, he says in his book African Origin of Civilization, he says, in fact, according to another scholar, Christopher Eheret, he says one of the major contributions of Africa to the history of man is man himself, i.e. even man originated from Africa. So we can develop this particular notion of the historic contribution of African continent to humanity generally, and then issue of our common origin, common identity, and common destiny. It will go a long way towards addressing these issues. And if you look at Pan-African congresses held in the 20th century, particularly 1920s, 1940s, and whatever. So I think Pan-Africanism is very important. It will help in, if you like, this issue of addressing some of the psychological, our psyche towards Africa or fellow Africans, that it will instill in us the spirit of this togetherness, spirit of oneness, the spirit of commonality, and whatever. We have common origin, common identity, and common destiny. We suffered colonialism together. We suffered many things even after colonialism. So at least if these ideas are propagated, it will go a long way towards addressing our mental or psychological infrastructure, mental furniture, so as we'll understand our common problem and then common destiny. So I subscribe to this idea, but it will take time to germinate. It has been done before, but yeah, in fact, Pan-Africanism even gave birth to the notion of OAU in 1963, and then African Union, particularly starting from 2002.
Some African countries are still at war. For instance, Sudan. What is your message for the leaders of Sudan?
I think my simple, direct message is for the leaders to go to the negotiating table. Because if you look at conflicts, war has never solved a problem. Conflict, do you get the point? The final outcome, you find out that you have to sit down and negotiate. Peace talk, ceasefire, okay? You look at the crisis in the Sudan, it's basically, it has political dimension generally. It's issue of clash between the two leaders. For example, Al-Burhan, the mainstream military, and then RSF, the rapid response, support forces led by Dogalo, General Dogalo, and whatever. So if you look at it, it seems to be more of this issue of clash, issue of try to how can we integrate RSF into the mainstream army, and then they have this agreement over the modalities and whatever. So these modalities could be agreed upon not at the battlefield, but on the negotiating table. So they have to sit down, negotiate, and discuss because it involves life. Many lives have been lost so far, properties destroyed and whatever. So it is high time we learn from history that major conflicts, this disagreement should be resolved on the table. If you look at even after wars, after fight and whatever, First World War, when it came to an end in 1918, you have to have the Treaty of Versailles, the Peace of Versailles, and then many things were sorted out, were resolved. So the same thing in the Sudan, the two generals and their supporters need to negotiate, need to have a genuine ceasefire, and then for the interest of the country, because the development, many lives have been lost so far, and then if the battle continue, definitely the country will continue to be backward in terms of its economy, politics, and whatever. So peace talk.
Ethiopia was also in conflict for over 2 years, but finally brought the issue to the African Union table, stressing the motto of African solution to African problems. And African Union has received appreciation for settling the problem. What lesson should be taken from this experience?
Well, this is a very good lesson. I think Ethiopia in this regard has shown the path, the way to do it, particularly in solving or resolving conflicts. If you look at it, yes, Ethiopia had problems, this issue, Tigray region and what have you, even starting from 2020 and November 2020, and it was resolved November 2022, about 2 years. So if you look at it, how, in fact, it's interesting the way the issue was resolved, particularly taking the matter to the African Union. It shows that it will help in restoring even the confidence of member states in the ability of the Union, the continental body, to resolve conflicts in the continent. So at least Ethiopia should be applauded, should be commended for taking this bold initiative, and then other countries should learn from this, that whenever you have problem, particularly continental, regional problem, you have a continental body, take the issue to that particular body, and then it will be resolved. And then again, on the part of the African Union should also continue with this effort, because if it continues to provide this robust solution to problems, then it will help it to have confidence, to regain its maybe confidence of the member states, so that whenever there's problem, the Union, continental body will be faced with the problem, and it will be objectively, fairly resolved. And then issue of justice is very important. When justice is done, then definitely member states will have confidence in the ability of AU to resolve dispute, as exemplified by the experience of Ethiopia.
South Africa and others are also teaming up to negotiate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. What is your comment on this?
I think it's a very good step, because Africa is not insulated from the effect of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because we rely on some of, for example, they have wheat. This issue of wheat is being imported by some African countries from Ukraine, from Russia region. And then, for example, if you look at even Cameroon, it imports about 44% of its fertilizer from Ukraine, Russia. So at least it has its own effect on the continent, specifically on some countries generally. And then we know the importance of wheat historically in the continent. It is used to make bread and whatever, cakes and whatever. So whenever you have problem regarding to the issue of food supply, then definitely it's a serious issue. So I think South Africa and these countries should be commended for intervening in this crisis, because they want to save their economy from the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, because it cut off supply of many things, particularly the products I mentioned. So it's a bold step, and this will also go a long way in changing the narrative, i.e. that whenever you have a conflict, you have the big powers that will just sit down and negotiate, but you see maybe African countries now with the initiative to intervene in order to resolve this particular problem. So I think it's a welcome development, and then they should be encouraged. More and more countries should also join hands with South Africa and others in order to see that the war is brought to an end for the benefit of all.
What should be Africa's position and response to the wars happening in Africa and in other parts of the world?
Okay, well, I think this is a very important question. If we have conflicts, for example, in Africa and maybe in other parts of the world, we cannot, the response of Africa should be defined by the issues, I mean, the context involved, okay, the parties involved. We look at the peculiarities of the time, the issues involved, and then this will determine our response. We shouldn't be emotional, okay, we have to look at the issue. So it means in our response, we should try as much as possible to have this unified approach. Do you get the point? I talk about this issue of unified approach, and then we're talking about even issue of African integration and whatever. So whenever we have issue, starting from issue of Africa, maybe conflict, disagreement, and whatever. So we should look at these issues objectively. We should look at the interest involved at a time. We'll look at the context involved or the power play involved. Then we'll take a particular position. So issue of objectivity, issue of fairness in dealing with, resolving issues is very important, because once we are not fair to one another or each other, then definitely our quest for achieving integration will be an illusion. So it's very important. That's one. Secondly, when it comes to maybe the outside world, yes, we look at the issues, as I said, objectively, look at the impact. So we have to, this issue of cost-benefit analysis, we have to weigh the options, look at the implication of, for example, this particular conflict. For example, now we talk about even the issue of Russia-Ukraine. Definitely South Africa and others have weighed the implication of the war on their economy, on their various sectors. That's why they intervene in order to put an, help in resolving the conflict. And it's a very good initiative. So whenever we face a particular problem, we look at the time, the interest, the actors, the implication of our decision. If we do that, then definitely it means we have this notion of strategy in our thinking, that's strategic thinking. So we have to be strategic, we have to be diplomatic, so as not to maybe hurt unnecessarily our neighbors, our friends, because we have issues involved, issue of our foreign policy. African countries have their foreign policies, and then the response is actually determined by their national interests, by their foreign policy. So it depends on the issue at hand, it depends on the actors, it depends on maybe the context we are talking about. But as much as possible, as a continent, we should try as much as possible to have this unified approach to issues affecting the whole continent. If we do that, then this will go a long way towards achieving, the long-term goal or objective of integrating the continent.
Doctor, have you got any final message before we wind up our today's session?
Okay, my final message in this regard, many issues actually. Africa is a very important continent in the world, historically and in contemporary times. Looking at the contributions the continent has been given to the world in terms of politics, in terms of economy, in terms of having social institutions. So that's why historically we said Africa, the major contribution of Africa to the history of man is man himself. According to Christopher Eheret, have contributed to human civilization and whatever. So after gaining our independence, we've started well. Actually, there was this issue of competition among various African countries in order to develop. That's why we talk about issue of industrialization, issue of trying to attract investment, try to provide infrastructure, because of the correlation between infrastructure and growth, as shown by studies by scholars like Oscar, Lee in the case of China, and what many other scholars, even World Development Report of 1994, discuss about the correlation, the nexus between infrastructure and growth. So my final message is that in Africa, for us to develop, we're talking about issue of integration, issue of development, issue of unity, issue of resolving conflicts and whatever. For us to do that, we need to address our fundamental, identify our fundamental problems, issue of politics. We should be development oriented in our politics. We develop our politics along this path. that will render service to the people, not to be served. So if we have this mentality, this particular psyche, it will help us. Then our economy, we need to revamp our economy. We have to diversify our economy. Those that have crude oil, should diversify into other sectors so as to avoid maybe this issue of external shocks and whatever, or to cushion the effect of that. Then we should address our infrastructure gap. One of the major problems we're facing, we have infrastructure gap, which we need continuous investment of about $90 billion to address all, our infrastructure gap. So we have to do that. For us to develop, we need robust infrastructure. Without infrastructure, development will be an illusion. So in addition to infrastructure, we have to develop our institutions. We have to make them strong. We have to have incentive package for our industries, for our traders, for our peasant farmers, who mechanize our agriculture. Then if we do that, then definitely we are enhancing or developing our economy. We want to see maybe in the next few years or decades, new Africa, whereby the continent is transformed into one continent that is economically prosperous, socially stable, ecologically regenerative, and politically peaceful continent. Thank you very much.
Dr. Misbahu Saidu, lecturer at the Department of History and Diplomatic Studies at Federal University of Kashere, Gombe State, Nigeria. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Dear our esteemed viewers, this brings us to the end. Thank you for watching.